Right, one thing I thought I would do, because basically I'm trying to make these like segues, like so that they make sense. So another tournament that's also begun is the LPL. So the reigning champions of the MSI, they will be playing LPL. Brazilian games are going on. Obviously, they have so many teams in that league. So one of the ways I thought I would tie this in is there are actually a couple of topics related to the LPL, but you don't have to watch LPL to talk about them, basically. So one of them actually is that it was announced, I think it was actually today, that I Will Dominate now gets co-streaming rights to actually do the LPL, which is quite significant because if people don't know, he actually was one of the few Western people who, out of choice, watched the LPL and wanted to do this sort of a feature because basically to him, after talking to him on shows and stuff, he sees the LPL as what the LCK used to be if you were someone like Monty. Like, if you actually want to be on the cutting edge of the game, you go to the best region, you study, like, the best games and the best teams. So, I basically, he does think that, like, LPL is, like, massively underviewed. I will say it has a million problems. Like, there are too many teams, there are way too many games. Like, I'll even throw in as well, there isn't even a rhyme or reason to the LPL in the same way as other regions because every single year, the fact that there are so many games and the fact that sometimes a team knows, like, well, I'm in third place for the playoffs and there's 4 series left and I can only drop to 5th or something. You get some very weird like upsets happening in the LPL. Like almost every split, you get a team who's like, you know, like fucking second place lose to like the team who's like 16th place or something ridiculous. So there are some weird ones. I understand that the regular season can put people off. But basically, I thought we'd start with that as a general topic because obviously core streaming as a topic is something that's massively discussed. And like, where do you come down on this, Rich? Like, are you in favour of core streaming? How do you see it within the Riot world where obviously in this particular case, you can't just choose to do it? Like in CS, for example, if I just contact the tournament and they happen to allow me to, they're fairly loose as to what you do. Obviously, you just don't have conflicting sponsors, basically. Riot does, within all these sorts of things, have a vibe, as you might have seen by I Will Dominate himself getting that ban from core streaming for however long it was, 6 months, a few months or something. They certainly always do bake into the pie, as it were, sort of. There's a sort of like a behavioural standard you have to meet, or don't be sort of outside of the Riot purview, what we think is cool. What do you think of the whole core streaming topic, Rich?
So I think that obviously there's multiple angles to view it from. I would argue as a neutral or as let's say a fan that I should probably be in favor just because I think the most important thing, or what should be the most important thing to a fan, is probably the growth and sustainability of the individual esports. And I think you're going to bring the most eyeballs most quickly by having co-streaming. I think there are a lot of games that people just simply wouldn't watch if they couldn't watch their favorite streamer co-stream it. I mean, for me personally, let's just take LCK as an example, right? Let's say LS is doing LCK co-stream. I watch LCK, yeah. So I watch LCK sometimes. I usually watch the playoffs. I usually don't watch that much of the regular season. If I were an LPL fan, hell no am I watching like the regular season of my own volition if like someone I don't know or like is not associated with it. That's not going to happen. So for me personally, I wouldn't watch a lot of the LCK games if I didn't watch LS co-streaming them. That's like just a personal anecdote. So I think for the overall like growth of the individual scenes, I mean, you saw it with Valorant, right? Valorant had however, like they went over 1 million concurrent for their tournament, but a huge chunk of that was just Shroud.
Yes.
Like, and when I was actually watching it, I never once went on the official stream. I only watched it through Shroud's stream, which wasn't nearly as interesting as I thought it would be, by the way. So yeah, sure. I'm not advertising Shroud's stream, but yeah, I mean, the guy had like 400,000 concurrent at one point during the final. So it's like, and I understand what the counter arguments for it are, but at the same time, I don't really see like too much downside, at least immediately. And for me, as I said, especially for something like Valorant, like if I was on the development, the scene development team essentially for Riot Games when it came to Valorant, I would be like, treating this as a roaring success and like, let's keep pushing the co-stream, like hell yeah.
This
obviously,
is the goal for them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously for League, the game's already much more established or whatever, but I still don't really necessarily see it as a bad thing. And as I said, if you have the right people in the right places to do it, as I said, someone like LS with Korea, someone who's very knowledgeable about LPL, if that's Dom, then great, then Dom with LPL, I think that will educate the scene about the other regions much more, make the game much more accessible. So yeah, I mean, overall, I'm in favor. But to be perfectly honest, there are probably some pitfalls that I haven't really considered because I haven't put like that much thought into it.
Fair enough. Where do you come down, Wicked?
From my perspective, I'm in favor of it. One thing I'm a bit sad about is that it's NA only, pretty much. Like the LCS was only open to NA partners. And now, because of that, Dom is also getting the LPL partnership, which I think he deserves because he watched all the games, he was really into it, and that's great. But again, it feels like it's NA favoritism, which I think is bad. And it also closes off the EU market a little bit. Then one thing I want to hit, I think co-streams are amazing and I think they're good for the scene. And I think it's great. But the problem is I think some co-streams can be too toxic and it can hurt players' brand a lot. So I think they should dial down a little bit on toxicity, just a tiny bit, like, right? They have to be real, they have to be authentic, but they don't have to completely shit on a player over and over and over again. And sometimes it's even unfairly. Like, I think Finn is a player who's been playing quite good and he's had good performances from CLG. And I think he's had negative comments, right, when I watch co-streams, too much, even though it was completely unfair. And then the last point I want to talk about is if you look at Fortnite, right? Fortnite was amazing at creating superstars. And I think co-stream is the same thing. And I think it's extremely good for the game. So when you make these co-streams, LS viewership blew up, Dom's viewership blew up, Doublelift is doing good, but he was doing good before. But I think this is a good way to create superstars that actually help the entire ecosystem of the game and the streaming of the game and everything around it.
I mean, one thing I do think is like a massive positive is obviously as the viewer, it's just more choice for you, isn't it? Like, in fact, I even think it actually, in some fucked up sense that people don't think about, it actually solves a big problem that I think we have, which is in line with what we were talking about earlier about how certain streamers and YouTubers and whatever dumb things down to hit like the lowest common denominator of all the clicks, and the essentially like 14-year-olds who don't know a lot about the topic might be able to engage with it. That's always been the problem I've had, which is because when I follow the game, I'm following it from a hardcore perspective of like esports only, probably not in the case of League of Legends because I have to talk about LCS, but in theory the best teams and only the best games. Like, I want someone who caters to that. So whereas I might like to listen to LS or, I mean, anyone, if someone like Monty had done it back in the day for LCK, I would have listened to him, obviously, if he hadn't been on the mainstream. The problem is that audience that actually is generally going to watch as a casual base, maybe that wouldn't be appropriate for them. Like, I could see a lot of like really, really casual fans being turned off by LS if they're not into the esports side. Say they are just the TSM fan who's just a fan of League of Legends and they like TSM sort of. Like, you're not going to want to hear someone go super in depth on the draft and say the game's lost because they picked something on R3 instead of fucking like R4. Like, you aren't going to want to hear that. Like, that's actually inappropriate for you on some level. So even though it's against my own interests in that sense, like, that's why basically I don't want there to be one stream. I want to have this like palette that I can choose from. Like, right, I like this type of a guy, or I think in case of someone like Dom, he's sort of marrying it all, doing a bit of entertainment, a bit of analysis, a little bit of for the casual fans because he has a lot of viewers himself. So I know everyone who's a big streamer knows how to also sort of communicate with the idiots in their fan base and just sort of like find a way to accommodate them. So I think it's good in that regard. One thing I do want to ask you about though, because this is one thing I do have my own qualms about, is I actually wonder how much impact it will have, though, because part of me wants to believe that a lot of people who watch Dom stream anyway will think, oh, I'll check it out, I'll try watching this game. But for me, one of the reasons why, even LCK, people on Reddit will all tell you they watch LCK. If you actually look at their takes, they clearly barely do, and they just repeat the same things and watch the big televised game, as in if it was like, you know, the equivalent of SKT versus KT a few years ago. Like, the problem I have is, in my opinion, in esports, a lot of people as a poser like to pretend they watch the best region and the best teams, but I get the feeling most people just watch the obvious ones. Like, if you're American, you probably watch LCS. If you're European, you watch LEC. Maybe you watch, as I say, the big game. Like, if Dam1 played Gen G, if they were the second best, if they play, maybe you watch that. So I actually wonder, though, how much actual crossover it will create. Like, do you actually think from this that a whole bunch of, for example, Western viewers are going to now watch LPL that wouldn't otherwise? Where do you come down on this?
I mean, I would say yes. In terms of how much, I'm not sure. But I agree with what you said about, you know, a lot of people just claim that they watch regions or whatever when they don't actually. But I think a lot of people that, for example, watch LS or watch Dom, and they're these people who claim that they watch it but don't really, I think now they probably will, or some of them will, right? So I do actually think there will be some crossover there. I don't think it will be like absolutely astronomical at the start, or I think it will be, you know, something that builds up slowly. But for example, let's say you know, LS is co-streaming LCK and he has 25,000 viewers. I mean, those 25,000 people, maybe they're not paying that much attention to the game, but they are watching LCK, right? And in my opinion, that's probably at least 20,000 people more than did before. You know, I think probably only 1 in 4 of Ellis's fans before he started co-streaming probably actually were watching like every LCK game, right? So I do think it will have an impact in that sense. But yeah, so just to touch on something Wicked said, because I think it's like an interesting point and a very difficult point to make good points around, I would say. This idea of like how it negatively affects the players, right? Because I think this is super important in that, you know, there is definitely this relationship between the community and like players getting dropped and fired. Like this is actually a real thing, even if people don't think it is. Like public perception and pressure does actually impact these kind of decisions. And how can you police it? Should you police it? And with these kind of things, I would usually be, you know, on the side of I think if you allow someone to do something, then you're allowing them to do it. And within the parameters that have already been established, this person should be able to say whatever they want, you know, within reason, right? I usually fall down on that camp. I think it's a very difficult thing to talk about reasonably. But I think if you look at other sports, for example, something that's become very big recently is the concept of like fan channels with like European soccer, right? Like AFTV is obviously like super famous. There's a Manchester United one, United Stand. Basically every team now in the Premier League pretty much has these fan channels. And obviously what happens is, and by the way, these channels get like a hell of a lot of viewership. Like the live watch alongs on like AFTV have like over 100,000 people watching and stuff, which are essentially co-streams, right? So these are big things. And obviously there's a lot of, you know, positive, we're all supporting the same team kind of thing, but there's also a hell of a lot of negativity that gets like doubled down on week after week after week of why is this guy still playing? He's absolute trash, and everyone piles in or whatever. And there's not the same level of relationship between like public pressure and like players losing their jobs in a game as big as football. There isn't, but it's the same kind of concept. So I think it's something that's very difficult to do, because in football, I would say it's not a problem, right? Or at least it's not a sizable enough a problem for it to actually become an issue in terms of affecting players. Obviously, you know, football players aren't immune to, you know, hating social media because people flame them, or hating newspapers. And same for, you know, LEC players, right? But should we treat them differently just because of, you know, we're essentially reverse engineering results-based analysis, right? We're saying because actually the result is slightly more negative, or maybe a lot more negative in some cases in league, should we apply a different philosophy? And honestly, I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not sure. Again, it's not something I've thought about like loads and loads and loads, but I do tend to side with the idea of if you allow someone to do something, like if I allow you, like if I'm a TO and I hire you, Thorin, for a Counter-Strike event to be on the desk, and I say, you know, our only rules are no swearing and blah, blah, blah. If you then, you know, go off script or say something that I wouldn't expect you to say, as long as it's, you know, not going against the parameters we set out, I think you should be allowed to do it within reason, right? So I think it's a very difficult one. And I'm not sure you can really police it effectively at all. So in that sense, is it really even worth trying to sort of construct something around that? Because LS might say something about, you know, an LEC player, an LCS player, an LCK player, which someone might perceive as being very negative. Someone else might perceive as really good constructive criticism, right? So I think it's really difficult. And I don't know what you think about that, Wicked.
Maybe Wicked can give us the vibe. Like, yeah, essentially, like, give us like a hypothetical. Like, what would be the difference between a comment that like might be like critical, and what would be one that for you is like it's building hate towards people, or it's too far? What would you give an example?
When I said that comment, I'm not only thinking about one individual player, I'm more thinking of the brand as well, right? I think the brand of entirety, the entire stream being toxic and just being negative all the time, and everything that's commentated out is almost negative. I think that's a bad brand to have, and I think it also turns people away from it. So I more think it's, as Rich also said, like guidelines, having some guidelines, follow these kind of things, and then they'll mostly solve itself, and it shouldn't be a big problem. Now, to the other thing Rich talked about, I think if you can make co-stream into superstars, like if you can make Ellis into a superstar, Dom into a superstar, and actually grow them, like Fortnite did with their players, I think the viewership would actually skyrocket. Like, for example, for me, I'm not going to watch other regions if Dom isn't streaming. I mostly just watch Dom's cast because I think it's the best way to do it for me. And often then it was only LCS or LEC casters. Often I would see the cast and I'd be like, I'm not going to watch this caster because I don't agree with what he says and I think his cast is bad. So I think it's very important, and I think this will actually grow the scene as a whole.
I have some takes here that actually might go counter to Wicked here. So we'll see. This might be my first proper disagreement. Because the thing is, if you haven't noticed, I can disagree and have a totally different perspective. It's just how I weave it in. But I'll say straight up, I actually categorically disagree with some of his perspective. But I understand it in the perspective that you're coming from the player perspective. You know what it's like for you personally to maybe be affected, or a teammate to be affected by criticism on Reddit. Right. One thing I will say, and actually in saying this, I'm not saying this just as someone who's biased because I'm not a player, because this actually affects me directly, literally me, but I also can see from sort of a wider perspective that I have to be able to get over this, which is this. I did a whole video on this topic where essentially I can go both ways on this side. I can totally see how, as a content creator, for example, if people keep saying negative things about you or keep saying things that you think are untrue, or even if they're true, they're really mean that they say, it will absolutely impact your self-esteem, your mental health, of all these things, of course. It will. No one's impervious, no matter how tough they might seem on camera. It's getting into everyone on some level, right? It's one of the reasons why personally I think it's ridiculous when the angle people try to take against me and Richard Lewis, for example, is that we're thin-skinned. It's by definition, we are some of the most thick-skinned people to ever work in this entire industry. If anything, that just shows what happens. That, guess what? Yes, a million small pygmy spears will take down an elephant. A million of them. That's the point. It's not that one spear takes you down. It's that eventually you can overwhelm the beast, as it were. Now, my problem with this, right, is even as I say that, I also do think that players and content creators have to be responsible with how much they expose themselves to that. So an obvious example would be this. It's very different if I asked, so let's take Sven, for example, because he's obviously recently just been benched. I agree, I don't think he played badly, but his team didn't do well, right? So I'm sure he got some hate no matter what, right? Let's say he went and read some of the Reddit threads, which I already would say don't do, but let's say he wanted to do it. If he read those Reddit threads an entire week after MSI, when he's chilled out, he's maybe seen his girlfriend or something, he's had a few days to fucking decompress, maybe he's even watched a VOD and he knows some of the problems they had, he might then be able to look at some of the comments and laugh them off and go, who cares, or this guy doesn't know anything, or he's not. But I tell you what, if he reads that thread, the second he just exited the server, losing the game, it's going to have 10 times more emotional impact on him as a person, right? So one of the things I'm sort of getting to here is, right, imagine we are just fans of anything, right? A movie, another sport. There has to be somewhere we can have what, yes, on some level are going to be toxic fan discussions. For example, I'll use Richard's example. If we're fans of Arsenal and they're not the best team, there has to be somewhere that Arsenal fans can discuss who should be kicked out of the team or who they don't think is good enough. So unfortunately, even though we all grew up with it as an area we think of as just public discourse, I do consider Reddit and Twitter on some level. I call them the virtual barbershop, because if you don't know, in black communities in America, the barbershop is the place to talk about sports, because while you're getting your hair cut and while people are waiting, people just shoot the shit. They talk about, this guy's not as good as, I don't know, fucking Michael Jordan was, or this team needs to cut this guy. And the idea is it's just a vibe where in that setting, if LeBron James actually walked in the back of the barbershop, we were all having that discussion, he's a fucking pussy, I think he just flops too much. Yeah, that would really hurt his feelings. But the question is, where do they have that discussion? And then B, LeBron James can't just live his whole life so that everything comes to a fucking halt because he walks in the room. People have to have their life as well. So on that angle, I sort of agree and I don't agree. I agree it is having an impact, and I wish in some utopia we were all aware of that and we didn't do it. But at the same time, I also do kind of feel like there has to be a space that fans can have those discussions. That's different from the co-streaming angle, obviously. I'm giving a more general take there, Wicked. What do you think about that?
So I think it's great for people to have the discussion. I have no problem with Reddit or Twitter and so on. I'm more thinking of the angle of a Riot-sponsored co-stream, right? Right. If it's a Riot-sponsored co-stream, then I think it should be toned down a tiny bit and not be overboard. And it's not like you can't say this player is terrible and he's playing badly, but it's just keep it within some limits, right? When it comes to Reddit, people should say whatever they want to say. Who cares? Who cares about what Reddit says anyway?
I had one other take on that, though, which is it goes like this. This might sound weird, but I do feel like fans don't stop and think about this, and maybe even some of the content creators haven't, right? So I'll give you an example, right? On any of my talk shows about League of Legends, you could literally make a bingo game, couldn't you? That at some point I'm going to say the words Reckless, Forgiven, Frog, all the fucking names. You all know the names. Now, what is one of the mad things that people do to me, right, to gaslight me, is they claim I'm just obsessed with all these players and I bring them up for no reason and with no relation. Now, anyone who's ever seen Twitter, social media, knows that can't be true because people always comment on me commenting on those names. So what I'm bringing up here is, I actually think genuinely, so I'll give you a classic example, Wicked. I think a lot of people did get upset for where on Dom's core streams, obviously there are certain players he appeared to target. A classic one is Ryoma, obviously, the player who was the mid laner for 100 Thieves, who just wasn't very good, unfortunately. Now, when he, as I say, people would say he targets him, like, focuses on him, singles him out. If he just does badly, he's going to say he did really badly, whatever. I know what people are going to build it up as. What people don't acknowledge is this. In my opinion, genuinely, if the only time on Dom's impetus that conversation ever came up was at the beginning where he said, I disagree with this guy as a player, and then every now and then he just referenced, I don't think he did very good in mid lane. I'm not joking. I don't think there would be even half as many mentions. What happens is you get caught in a feedback loop as a content creator with your own fans and the general fan base. And as I say, it's a feedback loop. What they say about what you say will then actually influence and affect how you then address things in the future. So as I've always said, I actually didn't, by the way, personally dislike Reckless until something mad like 2017 or 2016, because I actually, to that point in time, didn't have any reason to. I just thought he was an overrated player. But because I thought he was an overrated player, fans would tell me all the time that I hate him, I'm lying, I'm making it all up, which then just means if I get any other piece of info that corroborates my position, I'm going to reference it because it's constantly in my face. They're bringing it up over and over again. So basically, as a core streamer, like I would guess in that particular case, someone like Dom, what he's also responding to when he keeps signaling Ryoma out is what you don't see essentially, which is every time he goes in with a thread that was about his last video, it's people having the debate of like, well, is he being too harsh? Or I think Ryoma needs more time, or he's from another like that is actually feeding back into how you then respond, because we are all just like creatures of environment to some degree, it is going to influence you. So I know, listen, none of that's an excuse, by the way. I also agree. Part of me wishes I could be some Buddhist ideal and, only impart positivity into the world. But my problem is, like, just anthropologically, I think there's more going on there than people realise. Like, I don't really think a lot of the content creators are haters, put it out with. But I do think that really annoying fans can almost like lock you in some sort of fucked up game of chicken where you're just almost arguing against that fan, but it sounds like you're just targeting the player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same with me. Every time I bring up freezing or anything that LS have said, Rennick Tonic Gnar, it's instantly, oh my god, he said this about LS. And it's like, even if it's completely unrelated. Like sometimes I will say it directly about LS, right?
Yeah.
But often it's unrelated.
Fair enough. I just thought that was like one of those observations that I made that like people might not realise. Like, if you notice, what I tried to do, genuinely, is I tried to actually observe even my own life. Like, it was like a fucking David Attenborough documentary and just figure out, like, what's going on here? Like, what are the pressures? What are the inputs? What the impetus for doing something? Because I feel, what do you think on that overall, Rich? Because here's my problem. Like I say, part of me does think on the human level. Like, if I really met Ryoma in real life, I'd feel sorry for the guy. He's getting hated on all the time. But then there's also a cynical part of me goes, listen, mate, this isn't like you're just working down McDonald's and we're all being a dick to you, we need to make a living. Like, you did choose to opt into like a high pressure sports environment where you get paid a king's ransom to be good at the game. Like, there's a part of me gets cynical and as well, it's like, listen, if you can't stand the heat, get the fuck out of the kitchen. So where do you come down on this? And also I'll throw in as well, people know from my sense of humour, I have a very dark sense of humour, so even though I don't think that's always evil when you express it, I kind of do sort of like seeing people get flamed. I do it myself, obviously. So where do you come down on this? Because I think it's a complicated topic.
Because I think there's another aspect to it as well, which people don't understand, which is obviously you have the baggage, let's say, this was kind of the baggage of being a pro player, right? Which is you have to be able to deal with the social media and blah, 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 or that, that's part and parcel of being a pro player. But I also think for the people who are, putting the players down or whatever, they're also opting into something which isn't non-risk, right? And what I mean by that is if you put yourself out there and say, especially if it's, with someone who's perceived to be, very highly rated and you believe they're overrated or whatever, if you open your mouth on a stream or whatever the case is and give a completely conflicting opinion, which is perceived as negative, you're also putting yourself or your reputation on the line as well, right? Because you're basically endorsing a point of view, which is a negative point of view. And if it turns out to be wrong, like if there was some watershed moment, which, somehow And that will happen, but I think it's just one of those things which is kind of impossible to police. And so I would err on the side of, sure, you have your guidelines if you're officially associated with Riot about, trying not to swear every other second or whatever, and obviously don't bring up anything that could be perceived to be bigoted or discriminatory or whatever. But by and large, I think people should be allowed to say what they say. And I think if someone is just basically sat there just mouthing off about how they hate everyone and everyone's shit and how this guy sucks, and they're never really explaining it, they're just putting this person down, that guy will lose their audience pretty damn quickly, I would imagine. I think there'll be an element of correction that takes place regardless. And I think a great example of this, by the way, is LS, right? LS is constantly accused of going way too far and just shitting on players and blah, 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 or whatever. It's like, well, you motherfuckers still come back and, watch his analysis for 20 minutes afterwards, right? The same people who are writing those negative comments. So, and that's not me saying that because he has viewership, that means he must be correct. I'm just saying that I think by and large, if you're providing a service where you explain your ideas and you're sort of, being somewhat educational at the same time and saying why you think it's bad and you walk through your reasoning, then I don't think a negative opinion is necessarily all negative.
No, I agree with that. Like, I don't think any of the co-streamers right now are at a point where like, this is way too far, right? I just think it's something you always have to keep in mind, that it can go too far and it can be bad. Like, one thing, I read a book recently about growing as a YouTuber and so on, and one thing that you can notice is you can build rituals about shitting on a player, for example. And that ritual is something that people come back to because they expect it from you every time. Okay. And that can actually grow your brand as well.
Oh, of course. I mean, by the way, in that scenario, like that's an example, like the Ryoma Dom example is a classic one. Everyone knows that exact example, that he's almost like billed as like the villain against the hero of Ryoma, if you're a fan of that player. So, and obviously I've played that role myself many times.
But ultimately, he's responsible for his own words as well, right? It's like, sure, there's this added element of like, if enough people say something, does it apply pressure on orgs and stuff? And yes, it does. And that's an unfortunate side effect. But at the same time, if Dom's just sat there saying unfounded nonsense about Ryoma day after day, he has to, take the burden of the consequence that's going to come from that as well. So
there will be a backlash, of course. Yeah, eventually. Yeah.